Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 9th, 1992, presidential candidate Bill Clinton opted not to use his vice presidential pick to balance the ticket, instead selecting another young Southerner with centrist leanings to be his running mate, Al Gore. Al Gore had run for president before. He would go on to be the nominee in 2000, of course. Whether his presence on the ballot in 1992 actually helped Clinton win is up for debate, as is often the case with these things. So let's talk about it. Let's get into not just this pick, but some of the bigger questions around what it means to pick a vice president. I'm joined, as always, by Nicole of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And here for his third episode with us is John Dickerson of 60 Minutes and the new book, The Hardest Job in the World. Hello, John.
Hello, Jody.
So your book, The Hardest Job in the World, is about the presidency, and I'm going to do something that every vice president has probably lamented, which is make it about the president. So let me ask you, what can you learn, how much can you learn about a president from their vice presidential picks? And in this particular case, how much can we learn about Bill Clinton from his choice of Al Gore?
Well, there's the endless debate about balance in the ticket and whether the balance that's in the ticket is a meaningful event electorally or whether it's, when I spent some time looking into Eisenhower's pick of Nixon to kind of mollify the conservatives who were angry because he'd romped all over Taft and who they assumed would get the Republican nomination. It was less in the context, as I read the history, of a vice president who could pick them up a state, and more a kind of unity ticket that was built after defeating the golden-haired boy of Senator Taft. And so then we all know about Johnson and Kennedy. What strikes me about Gore that's interesting is Gore feels like one of those picks where the president said, I want a governing partner. I mean, certainly in the Democratic Party, picking another white man from the South was not what much of the Democratic Party wanted. And yet Clinton felt like Gore could be a governing partner in the way that Obama treated Biden, in the way Bush treated Cheney. Somebody who was going to do the work of the job and not just be selected for the electoral votes they might bring in or the constituencies they might wrap in for their party.
And I would layer on top of that it underscored the message of the Clinton campaign, right? This is a new generation of leaders, and both of them were incredibly young. And they were going up against President Bush, who had done a lot of really amazing things over the course of his career, but who was a waspish elderly man that they were running against, a member of the greatest generation, as opposed to a member of the baby boom generation. And so it really just underlined that difference.
That's right. The bridge to the future has these two people building it, and that's exactly right. And their kind of youthful energy of the baby boomers, that's exactly right.
They could jog together.
Indeed they do, in those tiny shorts.
Yeah, that was shorts. Yeah. You don't unsee that one, right?
That's right.
That was a less... Also, Gore also shored up some of Clinton's character challenges, too, which was helpful. And also, I guess the extent, although I don't remember this being made as an argument for him, but his experience in the Senate would be helpful in teaching the non-Washington. And that's why I was thinking about Mondale with Carter, the outside of Washington governor coming in has a vice presidential pick who knows the folkways of the town, which is actually legitimately helpful. I can't remember whether it was actually an argument for Gore at the time.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you mentioned the selection of Richard Nixon as sort of a way of shoring up a different faction within the party, because both Clinton and Gore were part of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, which was kind of the same wing of the party, right? These very centrist, technocratic politicians who were rejecting, in many ways, the McGovern wing of the party. It wasn't an effort to bring aboard McGovernites. It was an effort to sort of solidify this new direction, the third way for the party.
And to show swing voters that this was not your long-haired hippie bell-bottom Democrats, but pro-death penalty, pro-fiscal restraint Democrats who as an electoral pitch.
So, I mean, it does seem like there's maybe two types of VP picks, roughly speaking, one that maybe kind of reinforces some of the major themes and advantages that you're going for, and then some that maybe kind of fill in gaps. It feels like right now we're having a conversation with Biden mostly about the gaps. Can we see kind of in a larger sweep whether like VP choices are moving in one direction or another, or is it really case by case?
I think it's case by case, but I would say that one of the things that Gore is an important part of, that I think has been increasingly the case, is this idea of governing partners, that the vice president isn't going to be simply put into a broom closet in the White House and left alone for 4 to 8 years, that it's going to be someone with a portfolio. And you see that with Gore, who's given the task of reorganizing the entire federal government. You see that, of course, with Cheney, who has so much more federal government experience than George W. Bush has. And you see it with Biden as well, that they're real partners in the kind of work that they're doing.
And you saw with even when Dukakis picked Benson, I mean, it was somebody who had Washington's stature, where the expectation was that stature would be employed in the service of what Dukakis was running on. I think that's right. And having just spent so many years writing a book about what the presidency really is, it's really useful to have somebody that is put in charge of, or nominally put in charge of, some chunk of the presidency, because it's more than one person can handle, and actually increasing our view of the presidency as an organization rather than just one person would be quite helpful in changing our expectations for what the actual job is. I also like the way in which Obama used Biden, or at least my understanding of it, which was that in the debates about Afghanistan, to have Biden be the designated skeptic as they were discussing when and how to change their Afghanistan posture, military posture, to just always have somebody in the room who's playing that role. And, we also talk about chiefs of staff this way, too, who are playing the role as kind of the president's blind spot minder, somebody who's always poking at ideas, always covering for something a president might miss because of just the overwhelming nature of the job.
Nikki, with Al Gore, the kind of things we think of as his big policy legacy, certainly environmentalism, and then, fairly or not, the whole Al Gore invented the internet bullshit line that floats around. And I say that bullshit line as in, I think it's an unfair sort of disparaging of him. But what is your sense of kind of how much that kind of stuff played into this decision and his partnership with Clinton?
Well, I think it's important to understand who Al Gore was in terms of the Democratic Party. He came in the late 1970s. In the 1980s, he's part of this group of young Democratic legislators known as the Atari Democrats. Atari was a video game console at the time, for those of you who didn't get a chance to play it. But it was sort of like you might call the Silicon Valley generation or something like that. Like, these were the tech guys. These were the guys who believed that technology was going to revolutionize democracy, and it was going to revolutionize governing, and they wanted to harness that power. I mean, this is a conversation that's been ongoing in American government for a long time, but it also plays in to the idea of the DLC centrist thing, right? That if you believe that there are technological answers to everything, then you don't have to get caught up in debates about ideology. And that's the way that Al Gore wanted to govern. And then, of course, he comes into office with Bill Clinton, and I think they saw eye to eye on that. They just happened to come into office in the middle of this major culture war in the United States, and they were continuously sort of pushed onto that ground to defend their governing, when really they wanted to be doing something much, much different.
By the way, I worked for Atari when I was a kid.
Amazing.
As selling their computers and video games. And so this is an amusing that we're talking about this. But also in terms of that change in the Democratic Party from being a party of union toughs, the FDR coalition of labor unions, moving away from that and more to the technocratic side, which matches nicely with the reinventing governing, which was kind of marrying together the Silicon Valley whiz-bang entrepreneurialism with government and trying to reinvent it, was a kind of exciting, almost sort of Kennedy-esque type. We're bringing in our new, fresh thinking to Washington, which is why Atari Democrats is so interesting. What's funny, though, of course, not funny, but it just is a sign of how quickly things change. When in 1988, when Gore was running for president and was asked whose portrait he would hang in the White House as a debate question, Andrew Jackson was one of the presidents he chose, obviously for the Tennessee connection. No Democrat obviously would be mentioning Andrew Jackson today. But just to give you a sense of, while he may have represented a new kind of modern Democratic Party, he wasn't that modern.
Yeah, modern on a very specific vector.
Yeah, exactly.
One last question just about the kind of VP selection process. I'm trying to avoid the phrase Veep stakes. But, some of the other names that were floated at this time, I mean, it's as you would expect, a list of senators and governors. Bill Bradley, Ann Richards was on the list, Paul Tsongas, John Lewis. But then, you get to the bottom, actually, interestingly, John Sculley, who was CEO of Apple. I guess there was some reporting at the time that he was being vetted in some way. Marianne Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund. So, this feels like your classic mix of like senators, governors, and then curveballs, which may just be things to keep the press interested more than anything. This is all a long-winded way of me asking the real question that I want to ask, and the only question I want to ask, which is, does any of this stuff really matter, John? I mean, is Veep stakes pointless? Does a VP selection actually make a difference? Do we spend way too long, getting worked up about this just because there's nothing else to talk about between the end of the primaries and the convention?
Well, I think it doesn't matter until it does. I mean, the political scientists will tell you it doesn't matter, and certainly it doesn't matter relative to the amount of time we spend and talk about it. But I do want to rescue it from total worthlessness. It's a vehicle for discussing some other bigger things about the representation of certain groups in a coalition. I think you could imagine turning the question of a vice president into an interrogation of the management and governing strategy of the president and how the president wants to distribute power within an organization. If they're going to deputize a vice president to have control of certain things, why won't they do that with their cabinet? Now, the idea of cabinet government has, as Nikki knows so well, has had moments of ascendancy, and then reality comes and demolishes it because it turns out to be a huge failure, because you give all this power to your cabinets and then something goes wrong and the president gets blamed and you bring all the power back into the White House. But whether that's a good idea or a bad idea is really worth talking about. And if you could get some of that into the vice presidential conversation, instead of making it a who's up, who's down parlor game, it could actually be a vehicle to talk about the really interesting parts of how you load share in a job that desperately needs load sharing for a president who can't handle it all.
Yeah, and I would say that, one of the things that you've often talked about, John, is this idea of the presidential campaign as a kind of job interview. And so it is really one of the first big permanent hiring decisions that a president is making. And, does it matter? Again, like political scientists will tell you, not really. But you see something like in 2008 when John McCain picked Sarah Palin, that it seemed to undermine his message of country first. It seemed to have been done in a haphazard way. The reporting on the process suggested that there wasn't anything particularly orderly about it. And that was information that the voters took with them into the polls. It's a really difficult thing to measure because there are so many cross-cutting forces on what makes somebody make their decision for president. But I think that it does matter in the kind of stories we tell about a campaign, which end up being pretty influential on how people decide to vote.
That's an excellent point. And the person who I relied on, or where I got the whole idea of it being a job interview, is Al Gore used to say that. So
really?
Yeah, he used to say that
full circle
job interviews. So that was a beautiful kicker.
Well, there you go. All right. And one last kicker, as we often do at the end of the show, we talk about some other things that happened on this day. So I'm going to rip through a few because there are some interesting things that also happened on July 9th. And you can chime in if you have a thought or not. But, last episode, actually, we talked about a little bit about the District of Columbia. If you look at a map of D.C., you will notice that it is a perfect diamond, except for this weird cut off along the Potomac River in the southwest corner, and that is because in 1846, on July 9th, the territory of the District of Columbia south of the Potomac River was returned to Virginia through an act of Congress. John, D.C. native, any thoughts about great moments in loss of symmetry?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is it's the loss of symmetry. It's that but it makes a little sense because it's the river, but it's still, it just looks so tidy, and then it's got this ragged shirt tail on the southwest corner.
Which is, if you go to DC and you sort of learn that it's northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest, and then you start to actually realize, like, wait, everything is like this tilts really heavily towards northwest. What's going on here? And this is part of the explanation for that. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor dies unexpectedly. John, is he in your book? What do you have to tell us about Zachary Taylor's death?
He's not. I don't know if Zachary Taylor is in the book, but I do remember that I always thought it was odd. So he goes to a 4th of July celebration. Well, there's some dispute about how and why he died, but I think the prevailing story is he goes to a 4th of July celebration 16 months or so into his presidency, drinks a bunch of ice milk, which I always thought of as a disappointing drink under any circumstances. But and it was either the ice milk or the water he later drank that, anyway, cholera was breaking out, and they think that there was bacteria in the ice milk or in the water. But shortly thereafter, that was the end of President Taylor.
And then 1896, we just have to say his name, Nikki, because he's come up a number of times. William Jennings Bryan gave the Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, one of the more famous speeches in American political history. I will add that it also, to some extent, we're getting into convention season. So listeners, if you like stories about past conventions, mid to late July is when it really starts to heat up. But any quick thoughts on the Cross of Gold speech, Nikki?
Yes, most exciting speech about monetary policy that you will ever hear.
Yeah, but that's like being the tallest mountain in Florida.
Indeed.
All right, we're going to end it there. Thank you, Nikki Hemmer.
Thanks, Jody.
And thank you, John Dickerson. This was really great. And I will say that when we first started to conceive of this podcast, and I told a couple people, it's a podcast about small little interesting stories from American political history, a number of people responded and said, you're making this podcast for John Dickerson. So you really are. There is a mind meld here, and we thank you for all your work and inspiration, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and it was a delight, and you're right, it's right up my alley.
John Dickerson's book is called The Hardest Job in the World. Check it out. Catch him on 60 Minutes and the Slate Political Gabfest and lots more. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. You can find out lots more, including how to suggest a topic at thisdaypod.com. Follow us on social media at thisdaypod. Our producer and researcher is Jacob Feldman. Next episode, we will circle back to 2 previously discussed topics, but ones we had not done together: global pandemics and the turbulent year of 1968. We also have a special announcement that we'll make next week that I am very excited about. That's coming up on Tuesday. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.